On this episode of Drinks Around the Table, I sit down with author Aaron Bunce to discuss his experience publishing Grimdark fantasy, the influences on his cosmic horror, and whether he's a pantser rider, a plotter, or lands somewhere in between. Hope you enjoy. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Mr. Aaron Conway?
I'm good, Mr. Aaron Bunce. What are you drinking?
Well, tonight it is Boddington's finest pub ale. I've got a bottle of 18-year-old single malt scotch sitting out on my bar that my wife got me for Christmas a couple years ago, and I only have about that much left, and it hurts every time I look at it and try to think about drinking it because I don't want to see it all go away.
Yeah, it's always sad when you're down to like just I don't know if you do this, but like on the fancier bottles that I've gotten over the years, I keep the bottle, but it's always sad when that's the case. It's kind of like seeing old yearbook pictures of old girlfriends and being like, oh, I was so young then.
Nostalgia is a powerful tool. How about you? What are you drinking right now?
I'm just drinking straight bourbon. This in my classic pink cup is hot tea. I'm still
nice.
Kind of allergies are killing me with this. Anytime it's gorgeous weather in winter, I'm gonna be in pain allergy wise. So
I'm right there with you.
It's been rough.
Burning eyes, stuffy nose, crawling skin. It's the allergy hell.
Good times.
Good times.
So
misery and suffering.
Yeah. Let's see, where shall we start with you? You've got your book that just dropped in December. Was it December?
Exodus? It was December a year ago, actually.
A year ago?
Yeah.
God, has it been that long since we did that Oh man. Talk about time flying.
2020 ended up kind of being a hiatus for me.
Yeah.
I was still writing. I actually just finished a book today. Titan, nice. Which was the third book in the Necroverse series. So Exodus had just come out when I did the conference with you. That was when it came out in December. And then I spent the rest of 2020 writing a kind of a left field project for me, Savage Dawn. It's a werewolf supernatural story. So spent half the year writing that. Very different. So I was kind of struggling with it. And then the rest of the year writing the sci-fi horror, which lived up to its title in scope because it's the longest book in that series by 50,000 words.
Oh wow,
it got a little out of control, you could say that.
That's a lengthy tome.
Yeah.
So what's your writing day look like, or do you write every day?
I try to write every day. I've actually been fortunate since January, off on disability with the back surgery I had. So I got myself a stand-up desk in my office. I'm sitting down right now because I can finally sit down comfortably. That felt like a major accomplishment. I can finally sit down.
Right.
No, but it allowed me to spend this recuperation time at home working. So I usually get up in the morning and immediately make a pot of coffee so that I can function. And usually I will write for a little bit in the morning first thing, and then I will take my youngest daughter to school and I'll come back and I will work for another considerable chunk of the morning. I don't just write straight through. I do mini sprints. And because the internet is so full of distractions, I use this fantastic productivity timer my wife got me. So I'll flip that over and it's 20 minutes. So I know that during that 20 minutes, I am not allowed to look at anything but my manuscript. And
interesting.
Incredibly effective.
Really? Okay.
I've had writing sprints where I've written more in a 20-minute period than I had written the entire day before, like the whole day. So it's just a nice way to block out all the temptation, the distractions, and just focus on one thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. I've never
tried. That's most
it.
of my writing days. Just lock myself in my office and try to put together as many coherent words as possible.
Now, are you do you juggle multiple projects at once, or do you get a project, you finish it, you move on to the next one?
No, I've always got a handful of projects going. Like I said, 2020, I was working on those 2 projects. I'd already started writing Titan. As soon as I finished writing Exodus, those books flow right into one another. The story, there's no break, there's no time gap. It's just right from one to another. So I can jump right into one book after I finish the other. So I started writing that when I finished Exodus, but then I'd already been writing Savage Dawn, which I started as a prompt for one of my English classes when I was finishing my undergrad. That's actually where a lot of my books came from when I started writing, were these writers' workshops used prompts. I don't know if you've ever done one of those classes before, but they give you a prompt. It's a controlled prompt. It's usually speculative fiction, and it's usually between, I don't know, 900 and 2,000 words. And you just write it like you're writing a short story. Well, I've never really been able to write short stories. So what I did is I just approached each prompt like I was writing the first chapter of a new story.
Okay.
So throughout the course of these, I don't know what I did, like 7 or 8 different writers' workshops, I ended up with this nice sizable little pile of what was essentially starter stories. And Unleashed actually started out as that. It was a horror prompt. I wanted to write that based off the premise of kind of like when Dan O'Bannon wrote Alien way back in the day. He wanted to write a book or a movie about space truckers. I wrote this because I wanted to write a story about miners working in space miners. So it was this first sequence of a guy who gets this rock, this chunk of space rock, and they pull it in off this conveyor to his station, and he cuts into it when he isn't supposed to, because it scans it and it detects a void. You know, and their procedure is pretty simple. It's don't cut into anything with a void because there could be explosive gas inside. Rock cutting with sparks around explosive gas in space, bad idea.
Sure.
But he cuts into it anyway because he's a little low on his quota. I wanted to write that concept and have there be something alive inside the rock. And then I wrote that the first, I think it was about 2,000 words, submitted it, worked through it in the story workshop, and all the people who read it were like, what happens next? So what happens next? I'm like, I don't know, but I'm really interested to find out. So when I was taking a break from my fantasy stuff, because the fantasy stuff, I wasn't able to find the right market for it. I took a break from the fantasy, and I took a look at that folder. I remember the day I was looking through that folder on my computer, and I saw all those prompts. And the story or the title remained from when it was a story prompt with my workshop. It was called Unleashed. So I opened it up, I started reading it, and I got so into the story, I was like, okay, I have to find out what happens with this story next. So I started writing it, and it ended up turning into a full-blown 99,000 word sci-fi horror book, which was my most successful book at the time. It outsold all of the fantasy books combined. I think I found the right market with that sci-fi horror. And then I finished it and released it, and immediately had to write the sequel because I had kind of fallen in love with what is cosmic horror.
Right.
You know, if you're familiar with cosmic horror, like
Lovecraft, or like,
oh yes,
okay.
the new term, the appropriate term for Lovecraftian horror. I'll use either one. I don't mind using Lovecraftian horror, but I'm in love with the idea of cosmic horror. So that's what I've been writing a lot in over the past couple of years.
Nice. So are you typically well, I forget the terminology. There's, if you're a plotter or a seat of your pants. So do you typically just see where it's going as you're writing it, or do you ever outline?
Oh, that's a difficult question. When I started writing, I was a staunch pantser. I had a concept form in my mind, and I'm just like, you know what, darn it, I'm going to put my hand on the keyboard, and I'm going to see where this story takes me. And it's why my fantasy books are so long. although I love those stories, and I can't wait to one day jump back in and finish that story. I mean, I had to shelf that series, which was kind of a heartbreaker. But the more I learn, the more I can go back and rebrand the series and release it to better response. But
Is that
I
why?
wrote,
Is that
yeah,
okay?
yeah, it's Grimdark,
Yeah.
and I wrote it when Grimdark was just kind of becoming a recognized thing. I mean, George Martin had released Game of Thrones, in the 90s,
Right.
but until HBO bought the rights and then produced it in a show, you didn't really see a lot of published Grimdark stuff. And then you saw authors like Joe Abercrombie and Mark Lawrence and guys like that start to appear and really helped bring a lot of attention to Grimdark. And that's exactly what my series was. Even though when I first released it, I didn't know that it was Grimdark or really what Grimdark was or what it signified.
Yeah.
So I'd released the first book. I discovered what Grimdark was, and then was able to kind of like rebrand the series moving forward to capture that. But I didn't change what it was. I think it just helped me realize what that series was and the market that was for it. Because I was trying to brand it as just like epic fantasy, and it's too dark. It's too visceral and gritty to be epic fantasy. I think it turned a lot of the lighthearted epic fantasy fans off just because there's some brutal moments in it. But
I could get that. I mean, if you were going in thinking you were getting Tolkien and you got Martin, it would be a little shocking.
that'd be jarring. A whiplash, maybe. Yeah, but that's I wrote those books. I call myself a pantser, but I actually wrote in a journal. I keep these leather-bound journals, and I would write notes as I was writing the book. And it wasn't necessarily a storyline, but it was basically just to keep all the details and the figures straight.
Right.
I would create character glossaries and stuff like that to give characters unique voices. I would highlight and identify the individual things they would say, so that not everybody talks with the same voice. But I didn't use a storyline for any of those 4 books. And I think that if you include The Delving, which is the sequel, The Delving, Winter of Swords, Before the Crow, and A March of Woe, I think that in those 4 books, there's something like just shy of 900,000 words in those 4 books.
Man alive.
That's a lot for 4 books. But I didn't use any storyline for those books. I knew where I wanted to start with the story when I started writing the book, and I knew where I wanted it to end. And then as I would write it, I would see the rest of the arcs and the storylines come together, and then the story would kind of fill in between the cracks. It was a really neat experience. I did change a little bit with the cosmic horror stuff, the sci-fi horror stuff I write. I don't necessarily strictly storyline it out, but I take the rough idea I've got to begin with, and I'll write out a rough storyline. I'll write out the beats of the story, and then that way I get a pretty good idea of where I want to be when I hit each of these individual beats, and that helps me control the word count a little bit better, as well as identify like where each of these individual episodes that the books will represent will fall within the overall sweeping story. So it's funny that you asked that, because I use NaNoWriMo during November to track my progress. You're probably the same way, but I write the same every month. But November is the only one that I just use a different website to track my progress.
Right.
But they've got it on there. They call them pantsers. They call them plantsers now. So people who write by the seat of their pants, but use a rough storyline.
Okay.
So I'd say I'm more of a plantser now than I used to be.
I gotcha.
But this has been a pretty big year for me so far, because I started working with a video game development company called Epoch Games. I'm working as their primary script writer on a open world fantasy
Oh wow.
video game they're working on. So I'm working on the script for that. And then recently I started a co-authored project with one of my writing buddies, Chris Gould. We're working on an all new fantasy, and we're pretty excited about where it's going to go. I can't talk about it yet because
Sure.
we're actually in the works of shopping it right now.
Oh
So we're
wow.
pretty excited about where that'll go. While I continue to write these other books as well. So, but those projects forced me to do something I'd never done before, which was go in and create these extensive Google Docs with fairly well laid out storylines and character profiles. And I have all these details written because I'm not the only one that needs to have them now.
Sure.
So it's forced me to work a little differently, and it's different. I don't hate it.
Yeah.
I'll say I don't hate it, but it's different. It's very different.
Right. True. That's kind of how I do. I'm big on making the Bible first of the world building, the maybe not have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, but the main way this world functions, and then having the characters, whether I came to the characters first or the world first, it changes. But once I know the world, once I know the inhabitants, then I see kind of what story, like where should I put the camera? And
Gotcha.
I kind of go that direction. So I
So you
get
do the
that.
world building. You do all that world building first, and then you go in and you tell the story.
Sometimes, or probably more often than not, but I've had occasional ones where, so like my Timberhaven Chronicles stuff was literally just, I had all these weird characters that didn't fit anywhere in any of my other projects. And I thought, but I like the character. I'm just going to kind of stow it here. Stow it. And then eventually I had this small town full of these weird, quirky characters. And my first novel, Waking the Weaver, that's what came of that. Like, of all these, misfit toys, they just kind of coalesced and they started telling the story. And so that's how that worked for that one. And then I built the world around that. But with like Harrowed Earth, the book that's about to drop is a combination of multiple things. I have Daniel Moeller, one of my oldest best friends. We built a comic book universe because he's an artist slash writer. He's flipped over the years, focusing more on the writing and less on the art, but he's back to being artist and focusing on the writing, kind of, I guess, neck and neck. But anyway, we had when we were like 10, we built this comic, like, this is our comic world, this is what we're going to do. That's grown over the years, so 30 plus years of, because you can't, I mean, we had characters named Bulk, and we had, they're obvious ripoffs of known comic books, but Harrowed Earth spun out of that, where it's this kind of a post-apocalyptic Earth where there was an age of superheroes and that failed, and Harrowed Earth is where that story picks up.
Okay.
And that's more world built, and now I'm focusing on these characters that we made when we were kids, updating them. But anyway, so yeah, I kind of the Planter, that's a new one. I hadn't heard that one. I'm kind of that way, I guess, where I don't know exactly where things are going. I try to listen. I try to make a strong enough character that I can, like, what would you do?
They guide you.
Yeah, and I just kick out scenarios and then see what they like, figure out what they would do in that scenario.
And that's a really interesting thing, and I've heard a lot of authors talk about it, and I have experienced it personally myself. But knowing that and writing your books, have you ever had a character do something that surprised you? Like, you came across a moment in a story where you maybe hadn't planned it, but a character does something that just surprises you. Have you had that happen?
I've had to revert, or not the reverse, but the flip of that happened more, where I wanted the character to go and do this thing, and the character is essentially like, I would not, that's not, no, that doesn't work. Like, I wouldn't do that thing. And I found a workaround that works better in keeping true to the character. But I've had scenes flip on a dime where the character said something that changed the entire scene. Like, it was a piece of dialogue that just flipped the whole vibe of the scene. So I've had that happen.
Okay.
What about you? You've had it happen, you said?
Oh, I had it. when I was writing The Delving, that was it was a weird story because I'd finished A March of Woe, which uh, I wrote The Winter of Swords, which I first released as Within, and then I independently released it. And I think that in 2014, the first time when self-publishing, indie publishing was still kind of like the wild, wild west. There weren't a whole lot of really well-defined tools. There weren't a whole lot of really well-defined services. And I didn't really know what I was doing.
Right.
And so I decided to take a break. I'd already started writing before The Crow because it was all just a personal challenge to me at the time. But I decided to go back to school, and that's when I went back at my undergrad in English because I felt like I had Batman's tool belt on, but I didn't have any tools in it. Like I needed to get myself some writing tools and refine my approach. So I actually wrote before The Crow while I was going to school. And a lot of the writing classes, the English classes, the writers' workshops I was doing, I was using what I was learning in those classes at the time to refine that story and write it as I went. So I released that. I think I released that before I graduated. I worked on that and released it when I was still going to school. And then A March of Woe, which is the third, which I'm still proud of. It was my most refined. It was my best told story up to that point. I released that, and I was frustrated because I released that one, and that was kind of when I realized that Grimdark was a thing, and I had to go back and rebrand the first two to kind of match. And I finished it and I released it, and then I had a strange moment where I just sat back and I asked myself, I'm like, okay, so what do I do next? It's not a trilogy. It's supposed to be a 6-book series. So by finishing that book, I essentially came to the midpoint of the overall arc. But I sat down and I kind of looked at it and said, I spent the last year of my life writing this book, this huge book that I was so proud of. Where do I go from here? And through some weird twist of logic, I ended up coming up with, well, hey, I'll go tell this prequel story. Because there were things I wanted to tell in the next book, the fourth book, that I hadn't established yet, that I wanted to do, but were going to feel so jarring. So I flipped it, went back, and I wrote The Delving, which is this prequel, which takes place 10 years before the first book. So you get to see Denna is one of the main characters throughout the story, and you see her as a little girl in The Delving, and her father is the main character. And I just started telling that story instead, and then in a way to build the things that I needed to use to tell the story in 4, 5, and 6.
I got you. It
was a really weird, like twisting logic, branching, passing highways thing, but
I mean, if you had to have it, if it's got exposition that the reader will need in 4, 5, and 6, then I mean, you kind of had to do that, because I mean, it's one thing to incur a lot of narrative debt, which that's what I've run into with my first book. It's supposed to be a kickoff of a trilogy, and I've now published a collection of short stories that take place before the novel, and the next novel in the Timberhaven Chronicles takes place before the first novel. And in the first novel, I incurred all this narrative debt that people are like, are we ever getting to any of that? So, I mean, it sounds like you've got the reverse of, like, you didn't incur enough narrative debt. You needed to do your prequel to make everything jive.
Yeah, and it's hard too, because when you write these big sweeping fantasy stories, I didn't have that in mind when I wrote the first one. So I got to the point where I wrote the first one with really very little rhyme or reason planning. I just like, hey, this is the scene I want to write around. So I took a scene and I started writing the book. I got to the end of it. I'm like, wow, that's a big, and I want to say the first draft of that first book was 257,000 words.
Man, you deal in high numbers that I don't deal in.
Madness. I pared it down to about 231, and I think that 231 was the first edition what that was published at. And I want to say that the re-release, when I went in and re-edited after I finished school, I want to say that was just a hair over 200. And that 30,000 words I trimmed out wasn't story. It was really just me refining my language,
Yeah.
which was a big thing. Because when you're a young author, there's a bunch of things you don't want to hear. You don't want to hear you need an editor. You don't want to
Right.
hear you need a proofreader. You don't want to hear that you need to rewrite your work over and over and over again. There's all these
Yeah.
things that I didn't want to hear that, tempered by time, looking back at it later, I was like, yes, I do need to do these things.
Sure.
So yeah, it was a book that I never would have written before I started writing the series. But after I'd written that third one, I realized that if I want to do these things in 4, 5, and 6, if I want to introduce this aspect of the world building, which will ultimately lead to the final climax, if I introduce it in this book, it's going to feel jarring because it's like you're halfway through a series and you're just introducing this now.
Yeah.
Whereas it makes sense to jump back and tell this prequel story, do the groundwork. And that way, when people read into the other series, it'll be a little bit before they see it, but they'll see it and then they'll know what it is and you have that recognition.
Right.
So it's been strange. I probably did it in a manner that was fairly backwards compared to what other authors would do, but it was my method and it
Sure.
worked.
Well, I mean, you're a big Tolkien fan, right? Like, I
Mhm.
mean, nobody in their right mind would follow his method nowadays, but because his method, like his layout, his like everything it goes against like what we're taught of how to tell or how to write a book, as far as when to introduce characters, when to do exposition, how to do exposition. So I've got nothing against going against the grain.
Well,
As
and he
long
was
as
a
it,
linguist. He was a linguist too. So it was
sure,
like, hey, I created this whole language and now I want to write the story to use it. It's like, who nowadays is going to do something like that? It's just
right.
mind boggling.
And certainly have someone else publish it. Like, I mean, self-publishing, you could write whatever you want to write and you fine, but to do that and have somebody else foot the bill, yeah, that's not going to happen nowadays.
Yeah.
Which, more's the pity. So what is okay, so in your voice, like how you write, not necessarily what you write, but how you write.
Okay.
Who are your main influences?
Well, I'd be lying if I didn't say Tolkien inspired fantasy. Because my dad read us The Lord of the Rings when we were real little. He read us The Hobbit, and then the next thing he read us after that was we read all the books from the Chronicles of Narnia from C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
So very early on, I was baptized essentially in Tolkien and Lewis. As an adult, fantasy-wise, I stumbled across Bob Salvatore, who writes for Wizards of the Coast, and he's the one that created everyone's favorite dark elf character. And
yep.
I fell in love with him as a character. I fell in love with Salvatore's writing. I gobbled up his stuff. So I credit him as one of my influences as well. I have to credit Christopher Paolini as well, because it was Aragon that I read. I read it and I was so blown away that a 17-year-old had written that book that I told myself, and my wife and I have been talking about it, like, the 17-year-old did this. If a 17-year-old can do this, surely I can too. So he was actually the inspiration for me picking up the laptop and writing the first draft of my first book. When I got into sci-fi and horror, Heinlein was my first major inspiration for Heinlein. Red Planet was the first chapter book I ever read from beginning to end.
Wow.
I loved it. Have spacesuits will travel. No Time for the Stars. I read a lot of Heinlein. Read some Asimov Foundation, his series. His stuff was always a little more verbose. I kind of skewed more towards like the action, adventure, science fiction. So Heinlein was kind of more my speed.
Gotcha.
And then I got real heavy into horror as well. Ridley Scott's Alien was huge for me. Cameron and Aliens, I was addicted to science fiction horror, which is unfortunate because there is a whole catalog of just schlocky, horrible science fiction horror out there.
Yeah.
But that's why I picked up Unleashed, and I was very heavily influenced on Unleashed by Alien and some of the other body horror greats like The Thing, and I don't know if you've read it, but the one of the other major influences is when I was in school, I got really into reading Gothic horror, and the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde just so quickly became one of my favorites.
Yeah.
It was the that psychological inner battle between Hyde and Jekyll, and then with his butler, Mr. Poole, trying to sort the whole thing out and like keep the good scientist from like completely losing his mind.
Yeah.
So that, and then shows like Firefly and Battlestar Galactica, and just all this science fiction that I'd absorbed through the years just kind of like bubbled to the surface. And like a greedy little boy, I just started drawing on all the things that I loved so much. And that's kind of what went into the science fiction horror stuff.
Yeah.
But,
So do you shoot for more cinematic scenes in your writing because you've got such movie and television influences, or is it mostly character-based stuff that was your passion there?
I think when I first started writing, I was definitely very cinematic. I was envisioning these scenes and the fantasy stuff. I wanted it to be grand, and I wanted it to be, if it wasn't grand, I wanted the landscapes to be sweeping and majestic. And if it wasn't sweeping and majestic, I wanted it to be rainy and like boggy and muddy. Like I wanted the visceral, the guttural reaction inspired in people. But then the more I wrote, the more I kind of went away from like that cinematic thing, and the more I kind of trained myself to be character driven. I wanted to give these characters a unique voice, and I wanted to give them the moments that really help people understand like who they are and what drives them. So yeah, I mean, with Necroverse, there are definitely a lot of very cinematic moments with that scene because it deals with outbreak horror. So I mean, it plays very heavily on the body horror and the alien invasion and infection aspect of horror. So there's some of these very intense, grotesque sequences, which would obviously lend themselves very well towards cinematic.
Right.
But then there's other moments where, like with stories like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you get to jump into the characters' heads a little bit and play around with personality. And what I liked most about how I did Unleashed was Jacoby cracks that rock and something is alive inside, and it blasts out the hole from his rock cutter, and something embeds inside his skull. And, he blacks out. When he wakes up, he starts hearing this weird voice in his head. And it's essentially this alien presence that has latched onto a splintered portion of his personality he doesn't even know about. And you find out through the course of the story that he'd been abused as a child, and as a means of self-preservation, his personality essentially fractured. And then through him becoming infected by this alien presence, it latched onto and kind of took ownership of that personality as a mouthpiece, as a way to be heard. So he starts seeing and hearing this other part of him that he didn't know was there this whole time.
Wow.
You get to play with that idea of personality, and it also lets you play with some other literary tools like the what's it called, the unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Where a portion of him isn't necessarily telling the story in the most honest way.
Right. Reader doesn't know what to trust.
That's right.
That's good stuff. Well, we're running out of time here. Where can everybody find these fantastic tomes of yours?
Well, I am on, the books are all available on Amazon. They will be on Amazon. They're on Kindle. Print books are available on Amazon, Barnes Noble, anywhere else that print books are sold online. They're also audiobook. All my current books are on audiobook, and they're all available through Audible, or I think it's iTunes still does audiobooks, so iTunes or Audible. And then I also have a website and Facebook presence. So if people wanted to look me up on Facebook, I've got a readers group and a author page, and I've got a website as well, just under aaronbunce.com.
Okay. I'll put all that down below.
Fantastic.
In the meantime, thanks for having a drink with me, man.
Well, thanks for having me for a drink, my brother. AC?
Definitely. We'll do this again.
We will.
Till next time. Take it
Hey,
easy.
buddy.
And that wraps up our visit. Remember, if you'd like to get together, just reach out. We'll put something on the books. In the meantime, like, share, subscribe, do all the things down below. Till next time.